Hey, thank you for being interested in my model, which is collaborative therapy. So this is going to be a brief overview of the model. So the founder of the model is Harlene Anderson. Now, Harlene Anderson was at the Galveston Institute, and later they made the Houston Galveston Institute with Harry Galician. So they had plenty of conversations. So I'd be remiss not to mention him. Their ideas influenced one another. But in terms of if you were taking the licensure exam, and they said who is the founder of the model, you would say Harlene Anderson. Now, Tom Anderson, spelled differently, was also an influence. I believe he was Norwegian, and Harry and Harlene went and had a conversation with him, someone from an entirely different culture than the US, and they kind of mutually expanded their ideas together. I think I'll get into that a little in the next slide. So collaborative therapy is also referred to as collaborative language systems, abbreviated as CLS, or now the more modern, as of 2023, Collaborative-Dialogic practice. And the reason why is Harlene and Harry, again, at the Institute, were discussing what word they should use to describe this therapeutic process that they really enjoy, they feel is authentic, and they find is very helpful to their clients. So they were going back and forth on the word collaborative or maybe the word cooperative, and they looked it up in the dictionary and they said, well, no matter what dictionary we use, pretty much these words are still the same. So we, I guess, are going with collaborative, and that's really how they ended up on that. But if you listen to Harlene even now, you can hear her say, I would be open to a different word also. I'm just not sure what to call it, and this is the name that we have now that currently works. So I think that is interesting and notable. I don't know of any other model that would say, well, if you want to call us something entirely different, you can do that. It's just the idea behind the model, which is pretty cool. So it's influenced by philosophers first and foremost, and you will hear collaborative people say actually that from Harlene, not just because we like saying it, that it is not so much a model as it is a philosophy. So Wittgenstein was a okay, hold on. First of all, this is from my philosophical background, not from anything necessarily directly related to the therapeutic practices, but I thought I would give you the background on the philosophers so you could see how that influenced Harlene. Okay. So Wittgenstein wrote about language games, and he was talking about how we don't immediately come to language. It's not something that we're born with. We're born into certain cultures and environments, and we start to learn, this language is kind of associated with this. So when we're saying this, it seems like it's over here. Basically, there's not this one-to-one correspondence with language at all. So that's Wittgenstein in a nutshell. And then Heidegger, how do I describe him shortly? So you might hear him associated with the words hermeneutics and also phenomenology. If anybody is doing qualitative research, they might hear a lot about Heidegger and be influenced by his ideas. So, phenomenology is being interested in the lived experience of an individual. So don't just tell me a story of facts. I really want to know, like, how did you live in that moment? You think of, like, being, and actually being and becoming are two words associated with him, being the being and in time guy. So he would be really influenced by ideas of the zeitgeist. Have you guys heard of this? I don't know. This is rhetorical because I'm talking to myself. Okay, sorry. But this transitional process, being and becoming, it's a witness process, I guess. And then Bakhtin, which I'm not positive that I'm saying that right, any Russian pronunciation, but that's more or less how you say it, was influenced, or not influenced, but interested in language to the extent of saying, like, a monological conversation is a disaster, it's terrible, it's the worst. And that, dialogical conversations, kind of like that momentum, I guess, are what's important. So when I think about all three of these philosophers, I'm thinking about, okay, what do they have in common? It is this momentum. It is something deeper in a conversation. It's not just words. It's not like The Matrix, if you've ever seen that, where they like download martial arts, and then all of a sudden Neo knows Neo knows martial arts. It's not that process at all. So that's that idea, influenced by Tom Anderson, who I believe I started talking about earlier, the person who I'm pretty sure is Norwegian, and he was talking about like reflecting teams, so that's what he's most known for. And so Anderson, Galician, and Harlene were working together, and Harlene and Galician were, guests of Tom Anderson's, and they were noticing that, trying to say this succinctly, he had this process of the whole team reflects, and everybody shares their opinions on the client, and everyone's starting to become more aware, more open, the ideas are more fluid. They found it really helpful. And then Harlene was like, I like what we're doing. Is it possible that we could do this instead of after, when we're taking a step away from the client and we're all discussing the case, that we could just do it with the client in the moment? So that started to be essentially what they did. So they would self-disclose their thoughts about the client and about what was happening in the session. So your main takeaway from all of this is the withness, which is really the crux of the model. Then in this next slide, if you want to see all of her publications and kind of explore the website, I have that link for you there. And then here are the assumptions with the model, and you can pull up the collaborative language systems part of the models chart that I put together, and that says there's a lot of crossover, but I think it might be helpful to have me kind of explain it as you're looking at it, theoretically. So the assumptions that the model makes, remember, the philosophy is so important, it is key to this entire process. So it is postmodern. So postmodern just means you believe in multiple realities. And it's socially constructed, which means you believe that language is transformative and created in societies. So one of the examples is a table and a bench, and they might be constructed by a carpenter exactly the same way. But because of society, this is marketed as a bench. I will sit on this bench, versus this is marketed as a table. I know I will put things on this table. I'm not going to sit on the table. Anyway, just ideas of there's no absolute truth here. We're all kind of making our lowercase t truths based off of whichever society we're in, and we're doing so through language. So a key point there is how language creates. So in approaching this model, it can be a little disorienting. So I would first kind of try to get in touch with how it affects you as a person, and then move forward to see how you would actually practice it as a therapist. Because it is a model, I would argue the model that has the closest relationship between who you are as a person and what you do in the therapy room. So because this is a philosophy and a way of being, your presence is so important. Again, that withness that they talk about, you're walking alongside your client, it's very humanizing. There's not an expert stance. Of course, you have to have an asterisk because they originally said we take a non-expert stance, and everybody got mad about it. And so now there's a caveat of course, we're experts insofar as we have learned therapizing. We know how to do therapy, and we went to school for this. However, I don't know about my client's life enough to say that I'm the expert of their lives. And even if I met with them 100 times, a million times, an impossible number of times, they would still know more about their own lives than I would. So they really cultivate the host-guest relationship of kind of welcome in. I'm really curious about you. You're putting yourself on the back burner in a way to allow them space to come forward. After that is when you kind of get in that place of you're more parallel or walking together and working off of each other. But the client has to first know that you're presenting this option, because this therapy is different than most, if not all, other therapies. So in this way, the witness incorporates the, here's your buzzword, conversational partner. So whether I am talking to a student in supervision, or I'm talking to a client, or I'm talking to a friend, each of these are conversational partners. And so what I want to do is make sure that I'm avoiding monologue, and I'm making sure that that person has a platform to speak that's just as valid as my platform to speak. So even though inherently there's a hierarchy when it comes to clients or me being a professor, of me being in a position of power based off of that role, you lower the hierarchy as much as reasonable, but still in an ethical realm, so that you offer this platform for the others to kind of raise up and know that their worldview matters just as much as my worldview matters. So when we come to how collaborative therapists conceptualize problems, it really goes back to that philosophy we talked about earlier about social constructionism and believing in a languaged world. It means that language creates a reality. And that's a really bold statement, so I'm going to say it again. It's not that we're exploring and we're finding, we're spelunking, and we see, aha, there's reality out there, now we know the truth. We're not discovering, we are creating reality through language. This is where it gets controversial. But by believing that that language creates, you know that problems are kind of stuck in language. And then here's the hopeful part of, since they were created in language, they can be dissolved with language as well. So in other words, changing the language around the problem changes the problem itself. And how you do that is by engaging in this mutual dialogue, which allows for, more buzzwords here, of mutual puzzling. It's not that I am kind of leading behind in the way that narrative does, of kind of saying, well, like, what role does that offer for you? Something along that lines of you're offering the person space for an identity, but you're in co-authoring, you're pushing them along a certain line of the story, or the unique outcomes that you're highlighting from the subjugated discourse are, again, leading the story in a certain way. So it's not leading from behind like that, and it's definitely not just straightforward leaning, like structural, like Minuchin saying, this is what's going to happen, I'm leading the session. It's not like that at all. That togetherness, walking at the same pace alongside each other, I'll be redundant, but that's because it's really key to the model. That is the important takeaway. So this is just a current quote from Harlene Anderson that reinforces to me that these ideas are so important and key to who she is as a person, that they have continued throughout her whole career. So it's, well, you can read the screen. I'll read it to you anyway. Meet each person with genuine curiosity, and you will be surprised to meet someone you have never met before. And my interpretation or way to make sense of this, again, is privileging the client's worldview. I would argue when I'm in a session, I privilege their worldview as much, if not more so, than my own, because I want to learn from them. When I step back, I can kind of have access to all of my thoughts and opinions, like separate from that. But when I'm in the session, I am open to wherever the session goes. So Harlene was given all these clients who were known to be essentially whatever language they use, like difficult or failure clients, essentially. And then she was able to work with them, and everybody was shocked. How could you work with such difficult clients? But part of it is the fact that she was so open to whatever was going to happen, that she didn't have to take an expert stance. The session didn't have to go in one particular way. She wasn't having a monologue. She wasn't just giving advice to the client. She was really allowing them to educate her and using their language and learning their language, not just offering a bunch of like therapeutic words that we might use, like genogram or triangulation. So you wouldn't talk about that. You would be interested in the client's use of language. Okay, so the words that you're going to hear, I think I talked about this enough already. Postmodernism, social constructionism, the client is the expert, the not knowing stance, which is inherently tied with believing that the client is the expert, right? The non-hierarchical stance, which again is kind of like has an asterisk there because you know that you're in a position of power, so there is that hierarchy, but still you try to lower it. The fact that it's dialogical means that it's two ways. This isn't a Hamlet monologue. And the fact that your language is building on their language, which keeps going in this kind of cycle way, makes it transformative. And again, you can only believe that because of the previous philosophy that you believe that language creates reality. If language can create, language can transform. Both of you together are transforming your language, therefore transforming your realities, plural. So it's a really cool model because the therapist learns a lot about themselves and the world, essentially, the same as the client. Okay, so mutual puzzling I covered already. The problem organizing systems goes back to that language, and the problem dissolving systems goes back to the language. So if language creates, it creates the problem. If language creates, it can also create a solution. So it's more than a reframe, but it is along those lines of by changing the language, by presenting a different reality, you can get somewhere. But you're not reframing it like changing, like molding clay and then handing it to them and seeing if they accept it. You are doing this process together in the same moments with each other. One of the great things that they do is ask appropriately unusual comments or questions. So in this way, you are questioning everything. An example is success. What does success look like? Or love. What does love mean? So these are questions that somebody could say, well, what do you mean? Of course, you know what love is. But you really are interested, again, in their worldview, so you want a deep understanding of what it is. And this is what ties into deconstruction. If you're familiar with narrative and these other postmodern principles, that's a commonality that they have. And with that, you're not scared of paradoxes because you know from being a human being that paradoxes exist everywhere. So this is very much a gray model. You are not just looking for the black and white. And going through this, again, is the witness, is the mutual puzzling. We are thinking about this together. We're in this together. And I also talked about the host-guest earlier. There's also this idea of coaching. So I was actually hesitant to put coaching on the slide because it's not just you are coaching your client, like your client is mutually coaching you. Again, that transformative process that I feel like the momentum, maybe the hand gestures help more than just seeing it on PowerPoint. There is this process, and the process is ever moving as long as you do it right. Harlene actually said, like, it's easier to train students who are in practicum in terms of doing collaborative therapy on what not to do rather than tell them what to do. And the reason why is because it is so philosophical, so much of it will come from you just being a person and avoiding techniques. So you're not following a recipe, you're following who you are. So along that lines, you're avoiding monologue, I mentioned that earlier, facilitating the dialogue, back to the hand gestures, the curious questions lead to, or tie in rather with the appropriately unusual comments and questions, curiosity, and because of this, definitely non-pathologizing. So you are not saying, this client comes in, they have depression, the end. You are really curious about, What do you mean with by depression? Who told you that you have depression? Deconstructing all of that. So you're not accepting anything at face value, I think is fair to say, but you're also not being accusatory or pulling your expert card to say, no, I know you don't have depression, or definitely not the opposite of no, you do have depression. You would avoid situations like that. But of course, the asterisk is unless it would cause them harm, right? So if someone is experiencing suicidality in this extreme case, right, safety would become more important than taking this curiosity stance. Although I would hope that you would still maintain this curiosity while assessing for safety and making the phone calls that you might have to make. Okay, almost there. What not to do timeline. What you're going to do here is make sure that even though you need to know as a therapist how to hypothesize, you're not going to rely on that. You're not going to fall back on that with collaborative therapy. You're going to know how to do it in an academic, your competent way, but you're not going to do it insofar as you're not going to make assumptions about your client, which ties into the don't diagnose again. You don't want to pathologize, you don't want to limit your client's maneuverability, you don't want to limit your own maneuverability with the client by making all these assumptions. You're narrowing the scope more and more of what your practice could be. So always the asterisk of course, safety, but aside from that, you really want to make sure that you expand and make room for as many possibilities as possible. And like in the same vein, you don't want to advise your clients. So I say that you should do this, and then you should do that, and you should do that. Like that, first of all, in my experience, is not going to work. And then second of all, isn't really helpful. Not helpful insofar as, again, narrowing their worldview, narrowing their possibilities, narrowing your possibilities. It'll be redundant, but hopefully it will help you understand in the future and really know that, not just for a licensure exam, but if you want to experiment with this as a person and as a practitioner. Okay, so make sure that you are actively listening, and you keep in mind that both you and the client have something to offer. You don't want to dismiss the client's ideas. And actually, Harlene has an example in that Conversation Language Possibilities book, I think, where she talks about a therapist. Was it her? Not sure. I need a refresher on this book. Her or someone else working with a client who was, I don't know, schizophrenic, crazy, some sort of label, and just being able to have a conversation where you're not immediately saying, well, you're not hearing voices, or you're seeing something that isn't there, so scribbling something down on the pad, but being really curious about that, here's a philosophical term called bracketing. You put your own ideas on the back burner. Let me bracket for a second. I don't know, in this world of privileging the client's worldview, can I step into a space just for a moment where I consider what they're saying, of however outlandish it might be, to give a different perspective. And it doesn't mean that you have to stay there. You can go in and out you have your own thoughts and opinions, but you definitely make sure that they have a platform to express anything that they like. And then being mean. You don't want to be mean. Whatever you say about the client behind their back should be something that you're able to say to them directly. You don't want to be able to say behind their back that they're a terrible mom and they're doing everything wrong, and then you're sitting in front of them and just kind of smiling and nodding. That's definitely antithetical to the model, again, because it's so closely tied to who you are as a person. So similarly, you don't want to be opaque or untransparent, I guess would be opaque. So you're always trying to be transparent. You're always trying to disclose as it is helpful, not self-disclose when it's about you, but when it's about the conversation and the conversation progressing. And this goes along with one of her terms, which is being public. So being public is saying what's on your mind, because you know, if I don't say this, I'm going to be thinking about this for like the next 5 minutes. And those are the times where you're not present with your client because you're so focused on what you're thinking in your own mind. Okay, so goals. I just listened to another like podcast of hers, and she was like, I really don't like using goals, but I'll say goals, which I love. Same boat. So it's not exactly goals for your client because it's a philosophical process, and because you go about that through a transformative dialogue, and you're using their language, which is where the local knowledge part comes in, and you're making space for contradictions. So it's this process of learning, and a mutual learning. So your goal, I suppose, is to dissolve the problem, but what are you doing to make that happen? So altering the language about the problem, if we had to say, what's the goal? I guess that's the goal, right? Because if we alter the language, again, because of what we believe in social constructionism and language creating realities, if we alter the language, then we dissolve the problem. So going back to making sure that your meaning is co-created. Okay, we made it to the summary. So what do you do? So first of all, you have to like know the philosophy enough to make sure that this aligns with you. If you are a modernist, this won't fit well with you at all. If you are leaning towards a therapist role being an expert stance and seeing things in black and white, it just simply won't work. So be yourself, allow this to kind of, I don't know, percolate and see if it resonates with you. So if it does, all you have to do, quote unquote, is be yourself, be open, be curious, and follow the conversation again with the client. And reiterating again, you're not leading the client from front or behind. There's no leading, you're walking alongside the client. Mutual learning, mutual growth. And that's it. That's my last slide. Hooray. Cool. Thank you for hanging out with me this long, and I sincerely hope that this was actually helpful. So let me know if you have any questions. All right, bye for now.